This is the primal scream of a dying regime.
Pray for our enemies, because we're going medieval on these people. You're just not got a free shot on all these networks lying about the people. The people have had a belly full of it. I know you don't like hearing that. I know you try to do everything in the world to stop that, but you're not going to stop it. It's going to happen.
And where do people like that go to share the big lie? MAGA media. I wish in my soul, I wish that any of these people had a conscience.
Ask yourself, what is my task and what is my purpose? If that answer is to save my country, this country will be saved.
War Room. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome to the War Room. It is Thursday, July 30th in the year of our Lord 2026. Natalie Winters hosting a special edition of War Room, though we always focus on the Chinese Communist Party here. Frankly, I've always loved the name of the show, War Room. I think it's a particularly well-equipped name for today, given that the Chinese Communist Party declared a people's war on us a very, very long time ago. And it's time we, the Trump administration, and frankly, this audience, by being equipped with information, punches back. So today we're going to go through the vast universe, the influence networks that the Chinese Communist Party has curated for decades now. And now we're really seeing be weaponized, frankly, to go after the idea of putting America first, to watch us bleed our military might in corners across this globe, everywhere except our border that is conveniently open so Chinese nationals can pour in and establish sleeper cells here. But we are going to name names. We are going to get specific. We're going to highlight the sponsored trips, the dialogues, the people who have been taking cash from the Chinese Communist Party, not just to push the favorable narratives that we've been talking about for so long, but to help really give the Chinese Communist Party direct access to the corners of every American institution that help decide not just policy decisions, but shape the culture here into something that I think we can see on full display now can only be described as getting closer and closer and inching towards communism. Now, I want to start with a term that everybody in this audience should be familiar with, and that is, of course, the United Front Work Department. Now, there's always a ton of discussion about how the Chinese Communist Party conducts their influence campaigns, and some of this stuff is done on smaller scale. Obviously, you see the, trickled out stories, a few a year of a random former intelligence officer or former government employee who was recruited on LinkedIn by the Ministry of State Security, that's China's kind of spy agency, to give over classified documents. A lot of these cases are ongoing, and believe me, there are a lot more that haven't been found out. But the sort of more above board, at least from the PRC's perspective, way through which they actually carry out this kind of stuff is through the United Front Work Department, which is a multi-billion-dollar political warfare apparatus that is explicitly weaponized and used to target the elites in Western countries, particularly America. And it's really quite interesting. The people who are part of this, their strategy is really reverse engineering and understanding the power structures that animate American power. And you can see this sort of in the foil or the reverse engineering of the people that they target. They're not just going after the president. This is so detailed. They're going down to the level of curating congressional staffers, because of course they know they're who actually write the legislation, but taking them on these similarly, pay for play trips. I think they really exploit too a lot of what we see go on in Washington, D.C., which is frankly what I think we need to see legislation to prevent, which is people who only go into government service so they can have a nice revolving door opportunity after. They don't want to bite the hand that will inevitably feed them in the future. That is, of course, the Chinese Communist Party, all the various firms, lobbying firms that they will retain or that they have on the payroll. Now, why the United Front Work Department is so important is because it's sort of the oversight body for so many, of which there are dozens of these groups actively operating in the United States, but they also operate writ large across the world. When you talk about the Belt and Road, obviously a lot of that has been carried out by taking over infrastructure and port access, stuff like that, but it's also using actual, human tactics, basically compromising people. Sometimes it's literally with, bags of cash on some African warlord's desk to secure mining rights. But this is how they do it at the actual people-to-people level. And CUSEF, now we're going to get to the kind of boots on the ground, one of the key nodes there, though there are dozens of these groups that are active here, that are active everywhere, is one particularly egregious group. By no fault of their own, it's only because they have such a robust website and choose to really publicize so much of their interactions so frequently, which I think is maybe their fatal flaw. But CUSEF was basically the brainchild and founded by Tung Chee-hwa, a former chief executive of Hong Kong, but who also oversaw the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which is basically the coordinating body of many things, but primarily the United Front. So this is basically a front for Chinese espionage and propaganda. One of the pushbacks that we get, I'm sure you get when you talk about Chinese influences, oh, it's just about culture. Don't you love Chinese food or whatever? No, this is not that at all. I always say the buried lead is that they put China before United States in the naming of their organization, which just tells you a little bit about the world order that they want to bring about. But this is a group that is not just pushing propaganda, but it is an espionage organization that is using military-style political warfare tactics to co-opt and subvert elites to basically become, Chinese in action and push policies that are in line with the Chinese Communist Party. And all assessments that the U.S. government, the good parts of it, have put out about what this group actually is, describe it in much more nefarious terms than I do. So this isn't some right-wing conspiracy. This is something that, all China academics alike agree upon existing. Now, what I think is the most interesting part about War Room and how we really come into this information space is that the people who know the United Front exists are basically the people that the United Front is targeting. And that is why when I first broke most of these stories nearly half a decade ago, I was the first to do it because I was one of the few people who was not being targeted as the then, 20-year-old, college student by Chinese influence operations. Make no mistake, I've certainly been targeted by them, but obviously would never sell out. But I want to walk you through how this actually happens. It's such a vast, nebulous thing. But one of the ways that CUSEF really gained a foothold in the United States was through hiring US-based lobbying firms to give them access to Congress, to the presidency, and to also, more importantly, think tank types, those in, the executive branch, the former Deputy Secretary of State under Joe Biden, people who've held really, really, really important positions, even former directors of the CIA, have worked with them in some capacity, whether that's, doing sponsored reports with them, going on actual trips to China, but there's some form of connectivity with basically anybody who holds any semblance of power in the United States government. So one of the firms that they worked with was BLJ Worldwide. And it's through these FARA filings that you get the quotes talking about how they were working with journalists to, quote, effectively disseminate positive messages, quote, effectiveness and opportunities for favorable coverage, or how they were deciding which journalists to actually court. The tactics that they used, at least that they disclosed, were the private dinners, the free trips to China. Obviously, we've discussed that a lot. Targeting these influential, not just reporters, but also editors. And I think the most interesting part of the list of names, right, that we've gone through on the War Room now so many times is that sure, it's all the main ones, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, but it's also local papers too. So it's a really, really, really vast network that they've gone after. These FARA filings actually show that CUSEF was also working to influence American textbooks. BLJ helped them in what was very vaguely described as a textbook review for American high schools, particularly the sections talking about Tibet, where they claimed that they had inserted, quote, a strong factual counter-narrative. Now, that's something that there's really been no light shined on, but you can see it as clear as day, the Chinese Communist Party having influence over American textbooks. This firm was getting roughly $20,000 a month to do this kind of work. Obviously, the names of the journalists who were taking these trips where they were touring military facilities, touring companies that had been sanctioned by the government, are Ezra Klein, Matthew Iglesias, Ronald Brownstein. Those are the co-founders of Vox, CNN contributors, MS Now correspondents. I have the full list of names on my Substack. I've rattled them off enough for you. I won't take your time, but you can read those at substack.natalie or nataliewinters.substack. com, but basically every outlet there is represented. CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, Reuters, MS Now, Bloomberg, NPR, Financial Times, Newsweek, Time, Atlantic, Economist, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, BBC, ABC, Forbes, The Hill, AFP, Associated Press, and Slate. And obviously you saw this translate into very favorable coverage of the Chinese Communist Party, with quotes from participants like, Americans should accept that large-scale manufacturing will never return to the United States. Labor costs are rising in emerging market countries, but remain exponentially lower. Op-eds titled, China bashing is for losers. People warning against decoupling from China, talking about how great the CCP is when it comes to climate change, and even criticizing the way President Trump has engaged with China. Someone who has really watched this kind of information warfare evolve over the years, even looking at archived versions. And I should add that basically all the stuff you're hearing now is stuff that has basically been wiped from the internet. It's stuff that you were never supposed to hear, or it was never published. I just pieced it together. But back in the 2010s, even I think kind of the outgrowth of what you heard from the narratives about why China needed to join or ascend into the WTO, is that, China's economic model is so amazing and they've lifted so many people out of poverty and it's great if we work together. Kind of that Thucydides trap mindset, which I think is very defeatist. And it's this idea that China will win no matter what, so America needs to just get on board. But you can see that these narratives have started to shift around the time that President Trump came kind of on the national stage and really started talking tough when you had obviously phase 1 and phase 2 of the China trade deals. Then you saw a lot of these people sort of shift in their narratives, not so much praising China. People kind of wised up to that, especially post-COVID. But they were just attacking President Trump, attacking the show, attacking people who dared to criticize the Chinese Communist Party and call them out as the existential threat that they are. What is very interesting too about the CUSEF journalist targeting is that they didn't just go after established journalists. They actually set up the same type of trip, the sponsored trip to China, for journalism students, if you can believe that, from some of America's top schools. The first one was in 2016, interesting year, where they took 11 students from the Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, same style, delegation, where they were wanting favorable coverage. They were taking them to these sanctioned entities. But then later, schools involved include Columbia, NYU, Northwestern, Georgetown, Johns Hopkins, UChicago, my alma mater, shame, Johns Hopkins, and Columbia. And a lot of these people, I've done the reporting, you can see ended up either working, obviously, in journalism or going on. I believe one of them actually went on to work in Kamala Harris's office, funnily enough. But other law firms helped CUSEF gain this foothold where they were able to literally curate budding American journalists, though I use that term lightly. But some of the other groups were Capitol Council. This was the one that really helped them get a foothold in Congress, actually staffed by many former members of Congress. So the same people whose, salaries you were paying and frankly voting for, though obviously not the war, we didn't vote for these people, are now leveraging that knowledge, that expertise, literally on behalf of America's foremost enemy, the Chinese Communist Party. Another one, which, hold on, is the Podesta Group. You can't make it up. Tony Podesta, and also a lot of their staffers who were working on the account were former Hill staffers. They're former, people with ties to Hillary Clinton, just Democratic politics. But just over 2 years, they made nearly $1 million in just consulting fees publicly from the China-United States Exchange Foundation. And a lot of this work from these lobbying groups were designed to target members of Congress and former members of Congress. Particularly, there's a group called the Delegation of Former Members of Congress, or the association, and they were paying to take these people on these trips to China, basically to turn these people into soft PRC assets, in some case harder core ones. A lot of them, after returning, ended up setting up their own lobbying firms and taking cash from the CCP, which I would argue is just the somehow barely legal way to launder money in today's age when it comes to taking consulting fees from the Chinese Communist Party. I want you to stick with us through the break, because after the break, I'm going to read you the name of some of the members of Congress who actually took these trips. And we're going to get into how a lot of Black members of Congress sent nearly 1,000 of their child constituents over to China on communist propaganda trips. And by the way, this is just one of dozens of groups doing the same thing here as we speak in the United States. We'll be right back. What is the foundation of your savings? Is it gold or something that can be shaken, disrupted, or devalued? Birch Gold Group has been helping Americans solidify their savings with gold for the past 15 years. They'll help you convert an existing IRA or 401k into a tax-sheltered IRA in gold. Learn how gold fits into your portfolio by texting Bannon to 989898. You'll receive a free, no-obligation info kit. With an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau and countless 5-star reviews, let Birch Gold help build your foundation with gold.
War Room. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back to the War Room, which I have learned really likes when I name names, so I will happily do that. So we were talking about the former members of Congress who have taken these sponsored trips to China. Now, these ones are more interesting. I've been able to uncover more of the journalist names just by the nature of it. But there are still outstanding dozens of names of former members of Congress, some I'm sure you probably know, who have gone on these trips, which is why my appeal and, countervailing theme throughout all of this is going to be that the DOJ, this is why I'm focusing on these lobbying firms, subpoena these lobbying firms. You don't even have to get CUSEF involved to get the list of the names of people that they basically arranged the trips for, because they will have all this information. You don't even have to go after the individuals themselves, though I would posit they probably are guilty of treason. The former members of Congress that I was able to identify that have gone to China were Connie Morella, Barbara Kennelly, Phil English, John Tanner, Martin Frost, Charles Boustany, L.F. Payne, Gary Franks, Brian Baird, and Mike McIntyre. Like I was talking before, too, basically the entire Congressional Black Caucus, which includes just your favorite members, I'm sure, has been responsible for organizing trips for over 750 of their constituent students to go to China and basically have communist exposure trips. Some of the people that actually helped set it up were Marcia Fudge, who was Biden's HUD secretary, and Sheila Jackson Lee. You may remember the chick with the cowboy hat. Interestingly enough, too, CUSEF also worked with a lot of these, Black community leaders, as they were described, to set up the pipeline between Confucius Institutes, the hubs for propaganda and spying on American college campuses, with the HBCUs. But this group of students that went over to China, the reporting on this is a very old story that I broke, but it's really quite scary. A lot of these people, they forced them to give testimonials to CUSEF to basically weirdly, perversely thank them for taking them to China. I guess they were paying, so that's probably why. But some of these people, upon return, was one of the most striking quotes I ever read, was a young girl, probably around my age at the time I wrote the story, literally praising China as, quote, an amazing communist country that was better than the United States and that would continue to outpace the United States in basically anything it endeavored to do. I don't know about you, but filling your young, teenage constituents' heads with literal Chinese communist propaganda in the name of, equity and fighting racism, I'm not exactly sure that quite squares. And the firm that helped set up that was run by a chick named Julia Wilson. She's pictured with Obama, one of those types. They were paid more than $300,000 specifically to target the Black community, which I think is really interesting if you link that too to what you saw with the declassified document from Bill Pulte, where you can see, and even President Trump's speech, that a lot of the ways they tried to influence American politics was by really exacerbating and inflaming racial tensions. Obviously, there's been reporting that I believe it's the CPA, the Chinese Progressive Association, helped fund Black Lives Matter. People with deep ties to the Chinese government have also helped to fund a lot of these, racial justice movements. Joe Tsai is a big one. But talking about how this then gets to government power, one of the prime think tanks that CUSEF collaborated with, in addition to the Carnegie Endowment for National Peace, which was formerly led, the president was Bill Burns, who became Joe Biden's CIA director, who then lied to Congress about his relationship with CUSEF, saying he shut it off. He actually expanded it and made it work with even more sensitive technology, including nuclear energy and missiles and all that kind of stuff. But was the Center for American Progress, which back when they were working with CUSEF, was a much more influential think tank. It was basically what staffed like all of the Obama administration. This was what the Podesta group was really tasked with, making sure they could collaborate. They published joint reports, joint books, but they then hosted basically all their top, people in China for a similar pay-for-play delegation. John Podesta was there, if you can make it up. Wendy Sherman, who came on to be, or later became Joe Biden's Deputy Secretary of State. Melanie Hart, who was Joe Biden's advisor on Asia affairs. But this is a think tank that was basically writing the pro-China, white papers that was shaping how Democratic presidents were interacting with the Chinese Communist Party. Again, not literally pushing, the China is better than the United States. That's only, I guess, the Congressional Black Caucus delegates, but just really pushing these theories of engagement, these ideas that, we could coexist with China in a mutually beneficial way, which I would say COVID is probably the best example we can't, but maybe mutually beneficial for the people who are making millions of dollars off these lobbying arrangements, but not for the Americans who are being, force-fed the propaganda. And, it's actually quite, I think, disheartening to see how vast this one group, like I said, which was one of many, was able to kind of get its hooks into American society. I would say most concerning is that they actually worked with former very high-level multi-star generals in something called the Sanya Initiative. It started in 2008. It's not still active, but basically all of this has been scrubbed from the internet. But they use basically retired American generals, flag officers, people who were in the military, and I'll read the names of these people, flew them over to China for these sponsored cushy dialogues, where these were actually in partnership with a group called the China Association for International Friendly Contact, which is another one of these United Front groups that is even more military linked than CUSEF. CUSEF tries to pretend to be nice. The CAIFC is just straight up political warfare. But they wanted to do this so they could establish more military to military contact and collaboration with the United States, which is quite a precarious proposition. Mainly having to do with the issue of Taiwan. I would argue probably trying to understand the contours of American response and, involvement there, basically an espionage operation. But I just want you to hear the level of people involved in this. These weren't, random people that were low level. You have Bill Owens, the former vice chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Abizaid, former commander of U.S. CENTCOM, Norton Schwartz, former Air Force Chief of Staff, Carl Eikenberry, of course, the former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, retired Army Lieutenant General, Cameron Munter, former U.S. ambassador to Pakistan and Serbia, and John Hurley, former member of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. All of these discussions were off the record. No one really knows what went on there, but with all the cases you've seen of former IC members and military people selling out, there's many documented cases, these documents and stuff like that to China. I think it's extremely concerning that you have people going over there on these explicitly sponsored trips from basically spy fronts of the Chinese Communist Party. And to bring it all home, of course, we will bash neocons here in the War Room. But CUSEF actually lists two of its partners in the United States as the Carter Library, the Carter Foundation, and then the Bush Foundation. In September 2019, it was leaked that they signed a 5-year, $1 million annually deal with the George H.W. Bush for U.S.-China relations, which is run by Neil Bush. And you can really see Neil Bush has become a star in Chinese media. They always bank that Americans will never watch Chinese media. Not only has he praised their COVID response, he's praised China. He's literally said on video on Chinese TV saying that like Americans should be more open and they should hit us with more pro-China propaganda, and that China's not a threat, that, China is not our enemy and collaboration with them is good. And I think the War Room knows well enough that that is not the case. I want to pivot now to another related group. All these groups sort of overlap and do work with each other, but this one was sort of formed as an offshoot of CUSEF, similar people involved, and basically the same tactic. But this is the USHCA. I guess they learned that putting China before US in the title, it's a little too on the nose. But this is the US Heartland China Association. So they cover and target 21 of Heartland Midland states having to do with agriculture and farming. And this is a really interesting application of the sort of United Front CUSEF pay-for-play trip playbook, where instead of just going after journalists to cover these issues, which they do, and we'll talk about the deleted op-eds and stuff like that, they were targeting more the actual government officials, and not just the governors or the mayors, but people who were low level, but unfortunately the bureaucratic decision makers in these agricultural offices across a dozen plus states, even state legislators, right? They're going down to the lowest of local levels. This group was founded by former governor of Missouri, Bob Holden, who's also the former chairman of the Midwest Governors Association. They've partnered with the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, which the State Department has literally flagged for, quote, directly and malignly influencing state and local leaders. They've partnered with CUSEF, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, the China Chamber of Commerce, and various Chinese government organizations and entities themselves. But the program that they run is that they take, like I was saying, these agricultural officials, particularly mayors, overseas to China to basically try to whitewash this idea of agricultural collaboration and China owning farmland in the United States. They were even caught by yours truly by having journalists or random people write op-eds in local papers, kind of as like letter to the editors, to basically push for China being able to own farmland. After this break, maybe we got a flow here, I'm going to give you the names of those people so you can be on the lookout. We'll be right back after this short break. What is the foundation of your savings? Is it gold or something that can be shaken, disrupted, or devalued? Birch Gold Group has been helping Americans solidify their savings with gold for the past 15 years. They'll help you convert an existing IRA or 401k into a tax-sheltered IRA in gold. Learn how gold fits into your portfolio by texting Bannon to 989898. You'll receive a free no-obligation info kit. With an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau and countless 5-star reviews, let Birch Gold help build your foundations with gold. Text Bannon to 989898.
War Room. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back to the War Room, where we name names. We are just getting to the list of agricultural officials, mayors, people from the Midwest region who have collaborated with the U.S. Heartland China Association to basically take probably Chinese cash hand over fist, but at least contributions in kind from the Chinese Communist Party to push on you the idea that China should be able to buy American farmland. You have James Brainerd, the mayor of Carmel, Indiana, Tito Brown, mayor of Youngstown, Ohio, Rich Carr, mayor of a city that I can't pronounce in Iowa, Makokita, I apologize, Paul Tenhaken, mayor of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Bob Holden, the former governor of Missouri, James Brainerd, again, won in 2023, the mayor of Carmel, Indiana, Barbara Buffalo, mayor of Columbia, Missouri, Lee Harris, mayor of Shelby County, Tennessee, Chokwe Antar Lumumba, that sounds good, mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, Kim Norton, mayor of Rochester, Minnesota, Robin Tannehill, mayor of Oxford, Mississippi. And in 2025, how these people are still collaborating with the Chinese Communist Party. You can't plead ignorance anymore. You got Kim Norton, mayor of Rochester, Minnesota. She's a double dipper. Deborah Finan, mayor of Champaign, Illinois. Shondell Washington Spivey, a councilwoman, city of South Fulton, Georgia. Dan Gibson, mayor of Natchez, Mississippi. Hillman Frazier, Mississippi State Senator. Erica Sugarman, the vice mayor of Gulfport, Mississippi. They wanted these people to push these, sister city deals, MOUs, student exchanges, future delegations, but primarily push the angle that U.S.-China collaboration on farming and agriculture is something that is advantageous I guess for China is true, but not so much for the United States. The Sioux Falls mayor, Paul Tenakin, who I actually exposed as part of the media laundering program they were running with these people and other voices, and more so the local papers. But he actually published op-eds calling for deeper China relations. He deleted them from the internet after he was exposed, but here's a quote. The internet never forgets. It is time that Sioux Falls look at developing deeper, more consistent relationships with key Chinese communities and businesses, talking more so about how Chinese ownership of things like Smithfield Foods are good, and that his office was discussing, quote, business development opportunities that have Chinese ownership ties. One bright spot in all of this is another individual that I exposed, the mayor of Carmel, Indiana, for taking the trips. Though he didn't, his successor, who ultimately beat him in an election, Mayor Sue Finkum, explicitly disavowed and declared that the city would no longer be involved with this group. They denied their money, no future arrangement. So I think that's a bright spot, that when you expose these people and call them out, granted, most lawyer up, but sometimes their predecessors, when given the information, will do the right thing. But one of the ways that it's hard to do the right thing, and why you see this just complete and utter, I mean, malfeasance is too euphemistic a word, but really run through every level of government. I think probably the creation of COVID-19 is the best example of it, is because the institution that is supposed to, hold these people to account, subpoena these people, investigate these people, not just the DOJ, but Congress in particular, and fund or not fund these programs. That's one of the key targets, right, of the United Front, with the means I'm talking about, but also with blackmail, putting their spouses on the payroll, that kind of stuff too. And I want to link this to another story that's similar and related, but slightly different, more how these influence groups in action, really make it so the United States is not just aiding and abetting, but outright contributing to the military buildup and potential military ascension of the Chinese Communist Party over the United States. I think our scientific elites, epitomized by Fauci, think that science is borderless, and, we can collaborate with the Chinese, although they're probably communists, so they don't really care. But the Chinese view science through the lens, not just as a strategic national priority, but it's how they will gain supremacy over the United States. And they treat it as such. There's really no such thing as, non-military use science. It's all part of the same thing. But meanwhile, the United States government, our tax dollars, have been funding hundreds of studies that list as authors members of the Chinese military, individuals and laboratories linked not just to Chinese military capabilities, but to their intel and espionage capabilities. I think it's an issue we've seen at the forefront recently is talking about rare earths and semiconductors. And the United States Army has actually been funding China's top semiconductor lab. The U.S. Army funded research involving the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Semiconductors, the State Key Laboratory of Semiconductor Superlattices and Microstructures. Basically, these labs exist to help China gain an advantage over Western technological supremacy in this field specifically. And the United States Army is literally funding dozens of studies being carried out by those various groups I was mentioning. Similarly, for the semiconductors, the rare earths, you also have things like the State Key Laboratory of Rare Earth Materials, PLA hospitals, doing similar style research. You actually saw multiple U.S. agencies funding these same studies for decades. The U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, DARPA, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, and other U.S. national laboratories. The rare earth one is particularly interesting because this research has literally helped China gain a 90% stranglehold over basically all the processing of rare earth elements, and I think upwards of 70% of all the rare earths themselves. it's really quite ridiculous. I will have the articles. I know these are probably niche to find for the studio, but you can see the names of these studies. It is very clear that these are military use studies that your tax dollars are funding, very niche weaponized labs run by the Chinese Communist Party, whose explicit purpose in their charters and doctrine is to literally overtake the United States through scientific means. And these are the same materials that we need to use in F-35s and missiles and radar and stuff like that. The same stuff that, the Chinese weaponized against President Trump in his tariff negotiations. And when you look at the shortages, right, that we have that are now impacting our calculus when it comes to what to do in Iran, it really leaves you wondering, right? Is this technological advantages, not just the illicitly obtained ones through IP theft, but this is taxpayer subsidized. Fauci's probably the poster child for that, but in that same vein, obviously, we did a lot of reporting on the Wuhan Institute of Virology, much like CUSEF is to the United Front. The WIB is to a much broader network of Chinese labs that were receiving United States taxpayer dollars. That's probably in the thousands, but you look at specifically Army and military linked ones. One of my own investigations showed that the NIH funded over 250 studies involving explicitly PLA, People's Liberation Army researchers. They were either affiliated with the literal military itself or the PLA hospitals or various Chinese military universities. Most of the funding came from NIAID, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, while it was run by Fauci. But don't miss the forest for the trees, right? On the Wuhan Institute of Virology, this is a systemic problem that plagues our scientific community. And trust me, the Chinese Communist Party loves people like Fauci. They're the best thing that ever happened to them, because when something bad actually happens, what do? They then just amplify Chinese Communist Party propaganda and try to silence shows like War Room, who dare to even ask questions about, well, maybe this was linked to the Chinese Communist Party. And the NIH under Fauci actually signed a formal agreement with a explicitly communist and military-linked Chinese foundation that funds the People's Liberation Army. It was the National Natural Science Foundation of China. Fauci's office basically all went over to China on some really glamorous delegation where they signed this agreement to expand partnerships, to expand funding of research. Through this, they literally funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology, funded PLA researchers, and basically gave the Central Military Commission some of the highest levels of the PLA, of the Chinese military, technology and patents and information that were exclusive to the United States, no longer, and your taxpayer dollars literally subsidized it. And like I was saying, you now see this, kind of information be weaponized against President Trump. But even, you see billions being spent on the CHIPS Act, on critical mineral subsidies, these, joint venture deals that they're doing, domestic magnet capacity, restructuring and strengthening supply chains, and all the money that we're pouring into that. If we just hadn't built China up to have such a stranglehold, right, over all of these institutions and industries to begin with, the Chinese Communist Party would have pursued it by itself anyways. They're evil, smart people, but we didn't need to give them the keys to the kingdom. And I would add that the keys we helped make with our tax dollars. I want to broaden this out now to a news story and a new link. We'll name some more names, but kind of to where this all ends, where the struggle session ends up. And that is how the Communist Party USA has steep inroads and basically works with the Chinese Communist Party. Through reading a bunch of their materials, their documents, their individuals, looking at the relationships dating back to the late 1990s, there was a direct party-to-party relationship where the Chinese Communist Party invites leadership members over to China on these delegations where they treat them as, comrades in the struggle and are training them on Mao Zedong thought, are training them on, Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics, and really embedding them within the kind of Chinese quasi-Marxist structure on Xi Jinping thought. We've seen CCP members actually lecture at Communist Party USA events. A lot of the textbooks and materials that their official website recommends are actually Chinese Communist Party materials. And this is happening as we speak. Like I was saying, these delegations have been going on for decades. But there was one that happened just in May 2026, where 20 young communists from 18 countries, sometimes there's more United States representatives, sometimes there's fewer, went to China for a 2-week program. Was organized through the Chinese Communist Party's internal department. And these American delegates were taught about Xi Jinping thought, party governance, how the Chinese Communist Party could better support the Communist Party USA. And the participant, a guy by the name of Cameron Harrison, upon return, you can see his writings. This is on my Substack. I just published this article. It's nataliegwinters.substack.com or substack.nataliegwinters.com. I don't know, but you can subscribe for free. But upon return, he actually started lobbying for the Communist Party USA to take a softer, apparently they weren't soft enough, approach on China. And he also was part of the AFL-CIO and was actively lobbying the AFL-CIO to take a softer approach on China and to not be so racist or, anti-China, to not be guided by so much China hate. Basically trying to get, tradesmen and workers to like China through the legislation and just, referendums passed by the AFL-CIO. And it's quite crazy, too, when you remember that the AFL-CIO was one of the keynotes in that massive Time magazine profile talking about how they helped basically steal the 2020 election, even though we're told we're crazy conspiracy theorists for saying that. There's some more people we're going to name, but the CPUSA collaboration definitely deserves more digging into. We'll be right back. We wouldn't be celebrating America 250 if it wasn't for a strong foundation set by the framers. Hamilton built America's financial foundation on the principle of sound, stable money, a principle later embodied by the gold standard. However, we abandoned that discipline in 1971 and have since seen inflation erode the dollar's value. What is the foundation of your savings? Is it gold or something that can be shaken, disrupted, or devalued? Birch Gold Group has been helping Americans solidify their savings with gold for the past 15 years. They'll help you convert an existing IRA or 401k into a tax-sheltered IRA in gold. Learn how gold fits into your portfolio by texting Bannon to 989898. You'll receive a free no-obligation info kit. With an A+ rating with a Better Business Bureau and countless 5-star reviews, let Birch Gold help build your foundation with gold. Text Bannon to the number 989898.
War Room. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back to the War Room. I should add, basically all of the stories that you're hearing today are basically my life's canon of work. All these are stories or stuff that I broke exclusively. And it has been so frustrating watching what feels like nothing happened. It's great to call these people out and watch them get heckled and trolled on Twitter, which I encourage you all to do. But I really, really would encourage the Trump DOJ to subpoena these lobbying firms, to subpoena the USHCA. The joked China Select Committee on the Hill always loves, a month after one of my stories comes out or the war room breaks something, to send a strongly worded letter. I don't think Xi Jinping is intimidated by your strongly worded letter. And then nothing basically seems to happen. I guess they just get the fire sign to, destroy and delete all the documents. But I really think that you could have a reckoning in this country if you could publish the names of all of the people, all of them, who worked on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, took these trips, were involved with the United Front. Also to ask them the kind of narratives and stuff that the Chinese Communist Party wanted them to push, right? You can reverse engineer the enemy. Talk about, good intel, actually exquisite intel. But just to finish where we left off, Shen Ning, the North American Bureau of CCP International Department, participated in a Zoom webinar with the Communist Party USA, training her, cadres on why China was so great. And also too, they kind of play the same game with the COVID origins here, where it's like, oh, well, if you can't prove that, the CCP is paying the CPUSA outright, then they're not. It's like, well, maybe you can't prove that COVID originated in China, but that's only because they erased all of the evidence, in the same way that, maybe you can't prove that Fauci is I guess you can prove he's a megalomaniac from his appearance in the Senate by invoking the Fifth Amendment. But, you can't prove that he did certain things if he's not going to talk about it. So it's an interesting kind of information warfare game. But, just another kind of example, which I think it's important to put names to the faces. Dylan Austin Walker, he joined the Communist Party USA when he was 18, had leadership positions, I believe in Michigan, and was actually tasked with managing coordination between a local Michigan chapter of the Communist Party USA and the Chinese Communist Party and their delegates, make that make sense. But he now lives in China. He's like a star on Chinese state media. He praises China, describes, quote, Chinese and American communists as one big revolutionary family, is all over Chinese media, attacking Taiwan, attacking America, talking about why communism is so important, and basically on the payroll, I believe, of Chinese state media. I'm sure some probably weird money laundering operation going on there. But that's how you see these people get curated, right? I think that Dylan Austin Walker is such a good example. The other ones, they go to China, they come back, they're a little more discreet about their influence, right? All the journalists that we've named. But there are people, the ones that just don't care because they're actually out about their communist intentions and values. Well, those are the ones that just stay in China and quite literally become employees of the propaganda mouthpieces. I'm not that much a sappy person or one for metaphorical or poetic significance and irony, but I do think his case is quite telling when you juxtapose it with the stories of these other journalists that have been responsible for pushing so much propaganda here in the United States. So to sort of cap all this off, which I'd encourage you to go to my Substack. You can read all these articles, you can see the names, you can really digest it, you can chew it. It's curious to me, you can't really come away with any other conclusion than the Chinese Communist Party is at war with us. And yes, obviously there's extensive writing that they don't want to go kinetic, but when you look at their military buildup, just one of their shipbuilding companies built more ships by tonnage than the United States has in 1 year alone, in 2024, than we have since World War II. So I would say there also is a kinetic buildup there too, and also invading us through our open border. That's kind of an invasion, though I guess invited by Joe Biden. But I don't understand how, our elites, even within the MAGA world, cannot come to the conclusion that the Chinese Communist Party is a severe existential threat that needs to be treated as such. In President Trump's first term, he sanctioned a lot of these United Front groups. I would encourage him to do that again. I would get the names of these people who took these trips, name, shame, and embarrass them, out them. These people are traitors. They should be treated as such. And, the statistic that I always think about, and it's quite funny, is I believe the numbers, there was Gallup polling a few years ago about what % of people view the Chinese Communist Party or view China as a friend favorably. Joe Biden, of course, famously wrote the New York Times op-ed, China's rise isn't our demise. And in the same vein, when I think about that polling, the small, I think it was 92%, so the small 8% cohort of people who think China's rise is good, when Joe Biden says China's rise isn't, quote, our demise, the question is, who are you talking about? Who is that 8%? And what we are exposing here and what we've just exposed, I thank you for taking the time to listen to me, is that 8%, is the people who are not just invested metaphorically or ideologically, like the Communist Party USA, but are quite literally financially invested in the rise of China, right? We haven't even gotten into Wall Street and all the big corporations and that whole game of access and corporate espionage and just lust for market greed and access. But it's a serious problem, and this stuff needs to be taken seriously. And the Chinese Communist Party has carte blanche to run these operations in the United States. And, that's the downside of having an open society, right? You get invaded, literally, an open border too. Meanwhile, it's basically impossible to even get Americans into China to do this kind of stuff. I really thank you guys for taking the time to listen to me, all my ramblings. This is what I have dedicated my life to. It's important reporting, but you see why the Chinese Communist Party has both created a system that allows it to basically run roughshod over what should be the founder-intended checks and balances. Congress, the executive branch, the media, maybe not that one, but they've essentially co-opted, right? All those various aspects of society that make it really hard to out this cancerous evil. So that's why it's reliant on you, the audience, to share these stories and get it out there, because The CCP assets aren't going to do it. Find me on Substack, on X, Natalie G. Winters. Subscribe. It's free, and read stories and share them. Have a good one. Thank you guys for listening.